Hi everyone, I'm Shelly and you're watching There's No Place Like Home. Today I'm back with another Homeschooling 101 video, and I thought that I would share with you some practical oral and written narration tips. When I first started homeschooling and started reading about narration or hearing about it from other people, the concept was foreign to me. I actually didn't really understand what it was about. I knew what a narrator was, as in someone who was telling a story, but I didn't understand the concept of narration. So, for those of you who don't really know what narration is, it is very simply a child or anyone, as a matter of fact, telling back what they read, whether it is done orally or whether it is done in written form. So I thought that I would just share some ways that we incorporate both oral and written narration into our homeschool, because it really is a good way for you to gauge how well your children are listening. If, for example, they are narrating a read aloud, it is a great way for you to gauge comprehension if they are reading it themselves. And it is also a great way for you to just gauge how interested they are in a story and really what they think about it, how well they're understanding everything. So I'll start out with oral narration. Oral narration, when you are reading a book aloud to your children, can be a little bit different than when your child is reading something silently. So we'll just start with the read aloud version of narration first. Now, if you're reading to just a single child, it's a little bit easier than when you're reading to multiple children. So if you are reading to a single child, you actually have a couple of choices. You could read an entire chapter and you could ask your child to narrate the chapter back to you. And in order to do that, you could just tell your child, "Tell me everything that you remember about what I read." If you don't want your child to have to wait through the entire chapter, if you think that it would be too much for them, you could just do it also every few pages. Just stop and say, "What do you remember about what I read so far? How much of it can you tell back to me?" And so it's really not that much different with multiple children, just a little bit, obviously, because you have more kids that are going to have to take turns doing this. So there are two ways that we do this. I usually, right now, I'm doing a read aloud with 5 of my children. And so what I typically do is, if it is a shorter chapter, I will just wait until the end of the chapter and I will ask my children to each tell me back at least one thing that they remember. So, yeah, so they're not telling back as much as a child would who is narrating by themselves, at least not with this method. You could have them tell back more than one thing, but then what happens very often is that one child will take whatever the next child was going to take. And if it's a shorter chapter, there's not going to be a whole lot for them to narrate, which is why I will usually stick to it just being, one thing if you're doing it this way. If you are reading a longer chapter though, what I usually do, for example, I did this today. I was reading to 5 children and there were 17 pages in the chapter. So I just broke it down. Like every 3 or 4 pages, I would stop and I would ask one child, just one random child, "Tell me back what I just read. Tell me everything that you remember about what I just read to you." And then they would tell me what they remember about those specific pages. So that is how we narrate when I am doing a read aloud with my children. And, that's how we do it with single children and with multiple children. Now, when a child is giving you oral narration for a book that they themselves are reading, it can be something as informal as you standing at the sink doing dishes and them telling you what they remember from the book that they read. It doesn't have to be something where they are sitting there at a desk and are formally telling you back, unless you both enjoy doing things that way. But really, it can just be very conversational, and you can really pick up a lot of what your children are retaining in everyday conversations. So really consider doing things that way if they are doing an oral narration for a book that they themselves are reading. Now, written narration is another great way. Oral narration, it really prepares a child for written narration. So oral narration is really good for younger children who may not be writing yet, but it paves the way for them to understand sentence structure and to understand how to express things. And so this will help them when they do get to the point of written narration. Written narration, though, a lot of times people will think of when they were in school. And I know when my children were in school, they had to read, I think it was 20 minutes a day. And then their teacher had them write down 5 minutes, or not 5 minutes, 5 things out of the chapter that they read in those 20 minutes, and they would have to give like 5 things. And a lot of times my children wouldn't even be remembering it. They would just be going back in the book to write down things. So in that case, it really wasn't even written narration because it wasn't really coming from memory. But so that's what a lot of people think of. But written narration can be so much more fun than that. Your child's written narration can be something like comic strips. They could do a list of facts. Yes, they could just do a written narration that is composition style if they would like. And if that intimidates your child, but that is really something that you want them to do, you could just tell them, I want you to think about the story and everything that I read, and I want you to write it exactly as if you were telling me. So just conversational, have them write in a conversational tone in their narration. Beyond the things that I've already mentioned, they could do things like an illustration with maybe a paragraph underneath it telling what they remember from the story. Sometimes the illustrations, if they are detailed enough, they can even help you to know. So this might even be good for younger children that may not be writing on their own yet. If they draw a detailed illustration that really shows the things that either you were reading to them or that they read to themselves, well, yeah, I guess I'm talking about younger children, so they probably wouldn't be reading to themselves at this point. Sorry, I'm just thinking out loud. But anyway, an illustration can definitely show if a child was listening or if they were comprehending, especially if they are more artistic children. But really, there are so many different things that you could come up with when it comes to written narration. You could have your child write a poem about it. You could even have your child maybe write an alternate ending, because if they are including things that they remember from the story, they have to know those things well enough in order to do an alternate ending as well. One other tip that I do have for written narration, and this helps a lot of reluctant writers, kids who really get anxious when they know that they have to write something, is whenever we used to get done with our read aloud, I used to do a word slash phrase bank on our whiteboard. And I would ask my children to tell me anything at all that they wanted to remember about what we had just read that they want me to write on the board. Maybe if they don't know how to spell it, or maybe if they just don't want to forget something. So I am not the one telling them. They are telling me, and I am just putting it on the board for them to remember, so that when they are writing their narration, they might not feel as put on the spot as otherwise just trying to remember everything right off the top of their heads. And as children get older, they will need this less, but it is a very good transition for children who are just starting to write. So for example, they might ask you to write down, say if you were reading about the California Gold Rush, they might ask you to write California on the whiteboard if they don't know how to spell it. If you mentioned certain years in that book, they might ask you to, can you write down that in such and such a year, such and such did this. They might ask you to write someone's name down, maybe if they don't know how to spell it, or if they, just don't want to forget the name, because you know how as an adult even we forget names all the time. So this is really just to jog their memory and just to give them ideas so that when they are writing their narration, they can just look up there and they can be like, oh, that's right. I remember hearing about that. I remember reading that. And so really narration is a fantastic way to check, to gauge exactly what your children are learning, to evaluate what your children know. And, this is one thing. A lot of people are surprised when I tell them that I don't give my children tests. Other than the standardized tests that the state requires them to take in 3rd, 5th, and 8th grade, which I totally think are a waste of time. Other than those tests, my children do not get tests. So people will always ask me, how do you evaluate what your child is learning or how much they know if you don't give them tests? Narration is one way that I can easily gauge what my child is retaining, how well they're comprehending, how well they are listening, and there are a lot of other ways. I actually have a video about that too. I'll leave that in the description box in case you're curious about that. But anyway, that's all that I have for you today. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed yet and would like to hear more of what I have to say, I would love if you would do that. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave one either here or over on Instagram. And if you like my work, you can check out my Patreon page, and I will leave a link in the description box for that as well. And I hope you have a great day.